Now, here are all the elements of the famous narrative, probably one, if you've taken a history science course, that you learned, that has such significance for our culture. Freedom for scientific experimentation guaranteed by the Republic of Venice's protection for its professors. The refusal of hidebound philosophers such as Cremonini to even acknowledge the new sensory evidence. And the warnings about the dangers that lay ahead for Galileo if he left Padua. Of course, it is well known that by joining the court of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Galileo made himself vulnerable to prosecution by the Inquisition, which would eventually silence him and make timid many other scientists within the Catholic world. Now, to employ an anachronistic label borrowed from our own time, Galileo and his opponents were the principal antagonists, I'm arguing, in the culture wars of the late Renaissance. Cultural wars that pitted experimental science against blind adherence to Aristotle and religious dogmatism. Embedded in this narrative, or in this story, is the teleology of the triumph of scientific reason. This story has been so meaningful because we think we know that in the long term science will win over Aristotle and over the theologians because of its superior power to explain natural phenomena. And obviously what I want to argue today is that there are a lot of problems, I think, with this narrative, with this story. Now, to demonstrate that, let me talk about a less familiar story about Galileo and Cremonini, one based upon looking at Cremonini's career rather than Galileo's. And what we see is a rather different picture of the period and a different notion of what the culture wars might have been. In fact, one that is perhaps far more subversive to Christian doctrine than Galileo's Copernicanism, and one that pits Cremonini's and Galileo's against their arch enemy, the Society of Jesus. Now at stake were competing philosophies in this culture war of pedagogy and concerted attempts to influence the youth, particularly of the ruling classes of the Catholic world. The alliance between Galileo and Cremonini was one of more than mutual opposition to the Jesuits. Whatever their differences, they shared a profound skepticism about both received knowledge of any sort and the certainty of any claims to absolute truth. What they were doing, I'm arguing, was seeking open-ended methods of inquiry, and they practiced a certain style of intellectual life that led them very often to mask what was their most unconventional views. I want to talk about that masking a little bit later, and frequently pretending, in fact, that they were blind. There's a kind of rhetorical trope going on here about blindness. Cremonini took up this chair of natural philosophy in Padua in 1591, the year before Galileo arrived as the professor of mathematics. By the end of the 16th century, Padua had indisputably become the premier university in Italy, perhaps in Europe, largely because of the consistent protection the university had from the Venetian government, which guaranteed the liberty of its faculty. It is at Padua that the first botanical garden is established. It is at Padua that you have systematic dissections of human corpses in the training of medical students. Vesalius was at Padua. Falloppio of the fallopian tubes was at Padua. Harvey, who had discovered the circulation of the blood, had been a student at Padua. This is the great age of that university. During the late 16th century, however, the university started to feel serious competition from the local Jesuit college. One of the earliest houses of the Society of Jesus had been founded in Padua in 1542, and it had gradually expanded to accept non-Jesuit students and to enhance the curriculum beyond its pre-university level Latin schooling that had been the focus of Jesuit pedagogy, to add philosophy and other courses that would have normally been found only at the university. By 1589, the college had 450 students and had a 3-year philosophical curriculum that completely paralleled the lectures offered by the university. Now, in this expansion, the society had been supported by many influential Paduan and Venetian families who were concerned about the spiritual poverty and moral decline of the university, which had been cast in the worst possible light by the Jesuit sermons. These families voluntarily sent their sons to the safer environment where they would receive considerable more attention from their teachers than they would ever find at the university. The Jesuit reforms, in fact, were a direct challenge to the negligent and lazy habits of the university students, who were known at the time as the Bovisti, which is from the Palazzo Bo, which was the principal building where they took their lectures. These students who regularly paid their servants or substitutes to attend the lectures and to take the exams for them, so you could get a degree at Padua without actually ever showing up if you had enough money to do it. Competition from the Jesuit college directly threatened the status quo for the university students and the faculty, who were forced to increase their teaching loads by offering private tutoring and extra lectures in order to deal with this competition. And then when the Jesuits began to ring a bell, always the sign of a school is ringing of the bell, to announce the start of classes and to offer doctoral degrees, the tense relationship between the two snapped. In the spring of 1591, graffiti attacking the Jesuits appeared on the walls of their college. And then in July, 2 hot days it is said, on 2 successive days, students from the university surrounded the Jesuit college, shot off guns, smashed windows, and painted more anti-Jesuit graffiti. On July 12th, a group of university students, including some young Venetian nobles who were from prominent families, stripped themselves naked, dressed in sheets, and marched on the Jesuit college, flashing women and children along the way. And once in the college, they threw off their sheets, ran about naked, shouting obscenities to the Jesuit fathers and to the younger students. Now, the ringleaders of this adolescent prank faced heavy fines, but the incident, in fact, only increased the hostility to the Jesuits in Padua. Cremonini took the lead in defending the anti-Jesuit students by making a passionate polemical oration to the Venetian Senate that was full of exaggerations and quite clear inaccuracies, but it brought results. And after 3 days of hot debate, the Venetian Senate blamed the Jesuits and, in fact, ordered them to no longer accept university-level students who were not Jesuit novices. There were numerous attempts to get around this prohibition, but in 1607, the Jesuits, in fact, formally banished from the Venetian territories, and they remained banished for 50 years. So that leaves them out of the game in many ways. Now, the Jesuits respond with all kinds of insults against Cremonini. At one point, one of them calls him a mercenary philosopher, a man more used to carrying a scimitar. A scimitar is obviously what an Ottoman Turk carries, or a harquebus, which is a musket from this period, rather than a reading from the chair of public studies. He is a stinking spider who sucked out all the good doctrine and spat it into the ears of into his students only that of pestiferous venom. It gets even wilder and wilder on both sides as they exchange mutual insults. But in fact, behind all of this were some real doctrinal and pedagogical issues about what we might see as distinctly Renaissance concerns. The use of the humanist curriculum, which is what we usually associate with the Renaissance, which is the emphasis on the study of languages, on the power of rhetoric, and on ethics, versus the scholastic methods of inquiry based upon the study of Aristotle and of logical disputation. And in this, the Jesuits were in fact more modern than the neo-scholastic Cremonini. Now, the Jesuit teachers provided their charges with considerable individual attention that helped students make progress through each stage of learning. The Jesuits accepted the humanist proposition that the mastery of classical Greek and Latin language and literature inculcated virtue, This is this ethical strain in their thinking, and help foster Christian piety. There was a considerable emphasis in teaching upright behavior, so that their classrooms were quiet and disciplined. The Jesuits also concerned themselves with the whole student, providing not just for their formal educational needs, but for recreation and sports. The students were required to attend Mass frequently, to participate in the liturgical hours, to engage in a daily examination of their conscience, to regularly confess. In other words, this was a quasi-monastic environment. But the Jesuits also made it fun. They had a famous commitment to theater and dance in which all the students participated. Therefore, this Jesuit college in Padua represented a real challenge to the university, especially because whatever the philosophical debates, many thought the society provided a superior education, and from a modern point of view, they did. The Jesuits offered a complete cycle of studies, a broad curriculum, free tuition, systematic teaching methods, and individual attention to the students. Whereas the professors at the university delivered between 60 and 70 lectures a year, in the Jesuit college, each instructor gave 300 lectures, plus time spent in daily repetition and organizing monthly debates. And since you didn't have to pay the Jesuit fathers because they were members of a religious order, it's a very efficient and cheap way to run a university. The only way for a university student to receive the same kind of attention that the Jesuits offered for free was to pay his professors for private tutoring. And in fact, it's recently been analyzed that this private teaching in the university had a particularly corrosive effect on the lectures, which encouraged even more of the students to skip them or to despise them. I must say this is a long Italian tradition. When I was a graduate student in Italy, I didn't know anybody who ever went to a lecture. They showed up for the exams, and that was about it. The Jesuit critic of the university, a man named Gian Domenico Buonaccorsi, reported that very frequently the chatter, shouts, whistles, and banging on the broken and damaged desks make so much noise that for whole class periods at the university, whatever leaves the mouth of the doctor-professor disappears into the air and never arrives in the ears of the students. Thus, in this chaos, the serious students retreated to the privacy of the professors' houses for personal instruction. And this private teaching became very popular, especially among the students who could afford it and among the faculty who enjoyed the income. In fact, Galileo in 1606 made 44% more from his private teaching than he made from his university salary. Now, what is at stake here on both sides was their understanding that it's the loyalty of future generations. Many Venetians, however, distrusted the Jesuits because they put fidelity to the society and to the Pope above all else. As the Servite priest, who was also a famous critic of the papacy, a man named Paolo Sarpi, put it, the Jesuit schools have never graduated a son obedient to his father, devoted to his fatherland, and loyal to his prince. Sarpi rejected the commonly held opinion that the Jesuits offered the best education. To Sarpi, he said, education is not an absolute thing which has grades of perfection, of which the Jesuit fathers have attained the highest. But education is relative to government. Therefore, youth is educated in such a way that what is good and useful for one government is harmful for another. And education received variety according to the variety of governments. What is useful for a military state, which is maintained and increased with violence, is pernicious to a peaceful one, which is conserved through the observance of the laws. End of quote. For their part, therefore, the Jesuits subordinated all aspects, according to Sarpi, of their curriculum to the ecclesiastical ideal of government. So Sarpi's argument struck at the very heart of Jesuit pedagogy, which he thought did not allow young minds to grow through doubt and through the comparisons of alternative systems of thought. In fact, in Sarpi's view, and remember, Sarpi is himself a good Catholic. He's a priest. But in his view, the Jesuits answered far too many questions with far too much certainty. Now, Sarpi's well-known polemics owed a great deal, in fact, to Cremonini and to the Paduan tradition of philosophical skepticism. Cremonini's influence was also directly felt outside the university, where he founded an academy with Galileo, which spread their ideas. What we have recently discovered, and I think this is where the source of what I hope is my original contribution to this argument, is made possible by the fact that the records of the Inquisition, the Universal Roman Inquisition in Rome, then called the Holy Office, which was under the supervision of Cardinal Ratzinger, now Pope Gregory, was opened to scholars for the first time about 7 years ago. And one of the things we discovered in those archives, there and elsewhere, is that Galileo and Cremonini were persons of interest long before 1610 and long before there was a real concern about Copernicanism as a philosophy subversive to the Church. In fact, over a 30-year period beginning in 1598, more than 80 Inquisition files, with each one of which represents a separate investigation, were opened on Cremonini, making him one of, if not the most thoroughly investigated thinkers in the early modern Catholic world. And certainly only the protection of Venice kept him from Galileo's fate, or far worse. In fact, one of his students later on, who ventures out of Venice and finds himself in Avignon, is executed for his writings. In 1604, Cremonini and Galileo were jointly denounced before the Paduan tribunal of the Inquisition as heretics and consummate libertines. Galileo was also charged with practicing astrology and arguing that the stars controlled human actions. Cremonini's fault was the failure to take account of the immortality of the soul when explaining Aristotle to his students. As we'll see, Cremonini's denial of the immortality of the soul, in other words, arguing that the soul dies when the body dies, is the source of much of his trouble. The denunciation originated from a sermon preached during Lent in the cathedral of Padua by a Jesuit father who thundered from the pulpit that all good Catholics had an obligation of conscience to denounce the heretical opinions about the mortality of the soul that were circulating in the city, particularly in the university, and everybody knew he was talking about Cremonini. Now, Galileo's principal accuser in this 1604 file was none other than his own secretary, a man named Silvestre Piagnoni, who lived in his house and who made his living by copying out the workbooks that Galileo sold to his students. It's another Galileo is not all that nice a guy. I mean, he's selling the textbooks to the students, making a handsome profit on them, charging them room and board at exaggerated rates, having them take private lessons. Piagnoni himself, who was witnessing all this, was rather indiscreet, saying that Galileo never went to Mass or took the sacraments, that he kept a lover in a nearby house. We do know that. Galileo was more successful as a father of illegitimate children than he was as a teacher, and that he read unedifying books. Piagnoni reported that Galileo cast nativity horoscopes for many people and asserted that Galileo insisted that his clients, quote, should accept his judgment as solid and not doubt that they must follow his advice exactly. That's what's potentially heretical, saying that astrology is absolutely true. But in the end, Piagnoni backed off the heretical implications of these revelations and asserted that on matters of faith, I believe that he believes. The most revealing piece of information, however, is incidental to the charges. When asked who Galileo associated with, Piagnoni replied, he is with Cremonini practically every day. So thanks to the support from Venetian authorities, neither Galileo nor Cremonini faced any immediate prosecution, but the inquisitors remained vigilant, and there were new denunciations of Cremonini regularly, the following 1607, 1608, 1609, 1611, and at his death in 1631, all of his books were retrospectively banned, and he was excommunicated in the grave, if that's possible. The persistent investigation and systematic persecution of Cremonini certainly exceeds the Inquisition's interest in Galileo during the same period. But the Cremonini affair lacks the dramatic outcome of Galileo's trial simply because the philosopher was never foolish enough to leave Padua. The Galileo case, however, suggests some important reinterpretations of the Church's investigation of Galileo. The Cremonini case does, I say. The idea that the Inquisitors investigated Galileo because of his opposition to Aristotle seems, I think, far off the mark. Pope Urban VIII was known as an anti-Aristotelian. Galileo offended Urban, of course, because in his famous dialogue concerning the chief two world systems that led to the trial, he put in the mouth of a character named Simplicio, which means simpleton, direct quotes from the Pope. Direct quotes that obviously would offend him. But he could have put, in fact, Cremonini as the arch-Aristotelian's words in the mouth of Simplicio and probably avoided the Pope's wrath altogether. And in fact, when asked, Galileo throughout his life said he was an Aristotelian. But what if he was the kind of Aristotelian that shared Cremonini's views about the plurality of modes of inquiry and Cremonini's skepticism about the ability of any form of method, intellectual method, to discover absolute truth? In fact, this was always Cremonini's defense. Oh, in the intellectual world, I'm devoted to understanding how you can discover through logic truths, but they're not going to be absolute truths, and as a man of faith, that is a matter of faith, what we call the double truth. The most modern and astute modern reader of Cremonini is a German philosopher named Heinrich C. Kuhn, who has even argued that Galileo can best be understood as a reader of Cremonini, which is a proposition in some ways confirmed by the marginal notations we have on some of Cremonini's books known to have been owned by Galileo. These considerations raise the question of what did Cremonini actually think as opposed to what his enemies said he thought. Now, answering that question is not a simple task. To his contemporaries, he was considered to be one of the greatest thinkers of his day. To history, he has been given a rather bad press, as I've been arguing. Now, one way of doing this, is understanding what Cremonini really thought, was to look at how his philosophical interests always turned toward pedagogy, towards teaching. So it's not an accident that, in fact, his conflict with the Jesuits is actually about teaching. At the core of his philosophy is the student-teacher relationship. Unlike the Jesuits, who emphasized student discipline and systematic step-by-step learning through an approved course of instruction, Cremonini described the student-teacher relationship as essentially reciprocal. As he put it, the artist can work with whatever material is at hand, but the philosopher cannot teach just anyone, but only those students who are predisposed by nature and experience to understand his lessons. He contrasts the predisposition with discipline-induced docility, which might allow the student to hear, he would say, but not to understand. True predisposition enabled the listener to absorb the principles behind a specific lesson and then to be able to live them throughout his whole life. Of course, all of his students are males, so this is a gendered argument. One of Cremonini's examples of this predisposition reveals why I think he was probably so popular with the adolescent boys who were his students. Here's how he explains it to the students. The fact that, while dreaming of a girlfriend, we derive more pleasure from the dream than if we were really with her has no other cause than this, being that during the dream, the external senses are constrained and dead. The imagination presents to the soul a more excellent image of the world, a more excellent image of the girlfriend than she can ever actually match. Now, this experience of the girlfriend establishes what he would say is a first principle, but she can't reach human perfection through her own nature, but only when the external senses are cut off by dreaming. Similarly, the application of logic to any experience makes it possible to make judgments about the experience. You can see why he's unwilling to look through the telescope. The reason why is simply you cannot trust your senses. Now, the practical disagreements between Cremonini and Galileo commenced after the new star appeared, what the supernova of 1604 they called a new star, which intrigued Galileo, who had previously shown little interest in observational astronomy. And I think what I want to do is skip over this very quickly. But basically what happens is that Galileo and Cremonini engage in a debate about the new star. The question is, when observed, this new supernova, does it exhibit parallax? Parallax is the phenomenon that when you change a position and view an object from a different position, it will move. So if I am observing the moon in Chicago and you're observing the moon in Provo, and we exchange an email and have measured where it appears in relationship to the horizon, it will appear in a different place because of where we are observing it from. The moon exhibits pronounced parallax. To Galileo, he wrote to people in Verona and other towns and said, where exactly in the heavens is this new star? And it did not exhibit parallax from these measurements, although we now know that stars do exhibit parallax, but they didn't have precise enough way of looking at it. The telescope is still 6 years away. And so therefore, it had to be in the fixed realm beyond the moon, but it was new. That proved that Aristotle was wrong. That is to say, the heavens have changed because there's a new star. And it is precisely on that point that Cremonini says, no, it can't be true. And both get into a big debate, which is rather technical, and in which I won't get into, but which, in fact, elucidates the difference between these two different ways of thinking. One for Galileo, the primacy of sensory evidence. One for Cremonini, the primacy of logic. For them both, an open-ended inquiry in which they privilege debate over everything else. Now, perhaps what is most important about Cremonini and why he becomes so important is that he teaches a course at the university. Unlike Galileo, only a few mathematics students took his courses. He taught a course at the university that all the students in the arts and medical faculties take, the lectures on natural philosophy. And it is in those lectures that he, based upon Aristotle, who argues, of course, that for the eternality of the universe, and therefore potentially for a denial of the creation of the earth, argues that, in fact, the soul must die with the body. And since all the students took this class, arguing that in a Catholic world is a particularly dangerous thing to do. And it is this denial of the immortality of soul which signaled to the Orthodox thinkers a rejection of the entire Christian message and even of atheism. But was Cremonini really an atheist? His apparent rejection of the immortality of the soul brought him very close, but his public conformity to Catholic practice and his open recommendation to others that they dissimulate or fake it makes it difficult to see how far Cremonini's thinking might really have gone. It might be more appropriate to ask whether Cremonini's apparent denial of the immortality of the soul was in fact a kind of a mask. Was his denial a pose he took as a professor of Aristotle at Padua, a self-imposed test, so to speak, of his logical and rhetorical skills, even though as a Christian, as he claimed, and others have since claimed, he personally believed in the immortality. In fact, Cremonini always treated the issue rather playfully. And he is said to have written his own epitaph, Hic Jacet Totius Cremoninis, translated as, "Here lies all of Cremonini." In other words, in his tomb included his soul, which may be an encapsulation of his philosophy, it may be a joke, maybe both. You never quite know how to take him. And of course, among his friends, he was notoriously slippery on the issue. Galileo himself reports an account where he had a conversation with Cremonini, in which one of Cremonini's books had gotten in trouble with the censor because it couldn't pass muster. And Cremonini's response was, "Well, that's okay. I'll just change the argument so that it passes muster. I don't care. I can make any argument I want." So it raises the question whether he's just playing rhetorical games, and at what point is he ever sincere? Is this a form of sophistry? Is this a form of what we call, those of us who study the Reformation call Nicodemeidism, following Nicodemus, who denied Christ publicly but claimed to still believe in him? Or is this a way of sustaining some kind of mental reservation while putting on a mask of public conformity? In fact, his own interpretation of Aristotle was a dead end, but his intellectual style had an enormous influence on a whole generation of thinkers in Padua, Venice, and beyond, especially for those who came to call themselves a libertines, which connected his thought. Libertines in this sense means free thinkers rather than people engaged in obscenity, but which in many ways connected his thought directly to the French Enlightenment, which I could demonstrate, but we're running out of time. So in final, what was the cause of Cesare Cremonini's headache? Was it his reaction to Galileo's new discoveries that seemed to deny the Aristotelian worldview? Was it his fear of the challenge the Jesuit fathers presented to his entrenched privileges as a professor at the University of Padua? Was it his double life, or apparent double life, as a private skeptic and public believer masked by a belief in the Aristotelian commitment to double truth? Was it a conflict between his rigid Aristotelianism and his desire for freedom of thought, that is, his libertine impulse? Was it the strain of the intellectual game that transcended commitment to any principle? Now, I don't think I really know, but I suspect his friend Galileo did. Both of these men, who sometimes chose to be blind and to pretend to be blind, shared Galileo by sometimes writing under the pseudonym Blind Man of the Blind Alleys, Cremonini by refusing to look into the telescope. This blindness they shared, I strongly suspect, was a way of choosing a commitment to multiple forms of inquiry that embraced both Aristotelian logic, empirical research, and even theology, because Galileo is in fact no poor reader of the Bible. But they refused to privilege any of these. Their students, especially Cremonini's, embraced the same commitment to freedom of thought and expression. In their often outrageously skeptical and libertine works, they later found an academy called the Academy of the Unknowns. They all published under pseudonyms, and they managed, because the Jesuits were in exile in Venice, to get past the censors virtually anything, and they argue everything. By 21st century standards, it's pretty outrageous, some of the things they say, and they get away with it, and it's all through Cremonini's influence. Thus, in these late Renaissance debates, can one see the rudiments of the cultural wars that have sometimes made intellectual life a battlefield in our own times. On the one hand was Christian orthodoxy promoted by the Jesuits, who advocated an educational program that, even in their own phrase, left no child behind, rich or poor, noble or common, by emphasizing basic skills over intellectual flexibility, inculcating fundamental truths over creative exploration, and promoting ethical behavior over personal indulgence. On the other side were thinkers who did not necessarily agree on fundamental truths, other than their commitment to open-ended methods of inquiry that left room for revision, modification, and debate, to a pedagogy that treated the student-teacher relationship as reciprocal, and to a life of personal fulfillment most of all. Then as now, the bastion of the former was the church, and of the latter, the secular public university. And the objective of both was to conquer the minds of youth. Thank you. Do we take questions? How do we? You've got the microphone back there in the back.
Could you describe for me a little bit what the academic preparation of the Jesuit professors was in their college in Padua, and particularly what kind of scientific training they had, what kind of science they were teaching?
The question is what kind of training did the Jesuit professors have at Padua or elsewhere, and particularly what kind of scientific training they had. The Jesuit colleges, which start out to train Jesuit novices, have a pretty broad curriculum. They certainly have a curriculum that includes mathematics, and mathematics would include what we would now call science. Their science is heavily Aristotelian, just like Cremonini. That's interesting in one sense. But the Jesuits are very open-minded to a range of new opinions. So some have gone to universities. Obviously, St. Ignatius Loyola and the founders of the Jesuit order were at the University of Paris when they founded the order, when they took their original vows. And the University of Paris becomes a model for many Jesuit universities. The Jesuits, of course, established colleges all over Europe, all over the New World, enormously influential in the Catholic world. I would say that things are not pinned down yet at this time. There are certainly Jesuits who accept the Copernican system well into the 1620s. And of course, there's a major revision of the calendar, the Gregorian reforms in 1582. Is it 2? Yeah, which requires the Copernican system to work. So to make it work. So the church is open until Galileo perhaps steps on too many toes about this. And of course, it only was in the time of John Paul II that Galileo was formally rehabilitated. So it took a long time. They had a very good education. The great stuff is their attitude towards Chinese science. As some of you may have read, they're very open to exchanging scientific ideas in the foreign missions, particularly in China. Yes.
When and how did Cremonini get his bad reputation?
When and how did Cremonini get his bad reputation? Well, he's got it in his own time. The Jesuits are very see him as deeply subversive. And it probably goes back to this 1591 case when Cremonini comes before the Venetian Senate and delivers this scathing attack of the Jesuits when it had been the Jesuits who had their college trashed by these students. And they never forgave him for that. They're never allowed an official opportunity to reply, but they do. There are 5 different Jesuits who write replies to Cremonini. They're constantly denouncing him from the pulpit until they're exiled from Venice, and he is seen a thorn in their side all along. So within the Catholic world, he gets a negative impression, a negative view. Then within the history of science, that he becomes a different kind of bad guy. Because of people going back and reading his debates with Galileo, in which he takes the hardcore Aristotelian position. So the teleology of the history of science sees him as the backward thinker. But we now know from these Inquisition archives that Galileo didn't see him as a backward thinker at all. In fact, quite the contrary. So I think that's what I think is the biggest change in how I'm seeing things. Churches never bought Cremonini's act. I think now we have to rethink about how science would think about Cremonini. Yes, right over here.
Yes. May I ask for a clarification? You said that Cremonini got in trouble for taking the position on the soul, the death of the soul.
Right.
I assume that he was lecturing on Aristotle.
Right.
Now, was the problem that he was lecturing straight Aristotle? Because, as you're probably aware, in the De Anima, that is the strict Aristotelian position. Was the problem that he was lecturing straight Aristotle without a Christian clarification on that doctrine?
This is a matter of enormous debate. Okay, what is he actually lecturing on? There is an Averroist tradition of teaching Aristotelian philosophy in Padua. Averroes is the great Muslim philosopher, which leads to this rejection of the immortality of the soul. And the most famous philosopher who advocated this really is at Padua a century before Cremonini, Pietro Pomponazzi, whose works are formally condemned by the Church. What we know is what people said about him. We don't, and in his actual published works, he doesn't reject the immortality of the soul. But he's recurrently said to be saying this in his lectures. Okay. And at the same time claiming this is a straightforward reading of Aristotle. So I'm not sure we can actually know what he was saying. It's hard to believe it. You can't always believe enemies, but there's enough circumstantial evidence that he's raising the question. And is he raising the question to get his students to think? That's probably what he would say. But I don't know. It's really debated. It's still much a debate among the philosophers whether he's a Christian or rejects that. Question back here.
What would you say is the greatest legacy that these two men have left for us?
What is the greatest legacy of these two men for us? Well, that's a very good question. The Galileo is one that is so embedded in our understanding of of modernity over the last 400 years, that it's in which he is the patron saint of scientific method. So in many ways, he still is that. We see him as the first scientist, and he still is that in many ways. I don't think I can take that away from him. I want to complicate that picture a little bit by saying that his view of the relationship between science, logic, and scripture was not one-sided at all, and he liked the open-ended debate. Cremonini's influence is through technical philosophy. We know that he strongly influenced Leibniz. He strongly influenced the Enlightenment thinkers of France. So what Cremonini's influence, I think, should primarily be is to sustaining a certain kind of intellectual skepticism and openness to the freedom of thought, which was possible in Padua in a way that it probably wasn't anywhere else in the early 17th century. He's not somebody that people read directly himself anymore. I think it's more through the influence of his students and a long legacy that leads to the Enlightenment. This is a piece of a bigger project in which I'm arguing that in early 17th century you can see many of the elements of the Enlightenment in Venice in this brief period when there wasn't press censorship, and this is part of it. Okay? Thanks a lot.